Welcome to today's exciting panel discussion, Social Justice in the Classroom. Your co-facilitators for this breakout session, yours truly, Dr. Wafik Sabir, Associate Professor of Sociology and Criminal Justice at Trinity River Campus, and Government Instructor Karina White. Also from the Trinity River Campus in lovely downtown Fort Worth. So as we settle in our big chairs, our bean bags, our couches, we just want to take a few housekeeping notes. Okay, just want to share a few things with you. So most of us are probably very familiar with Zoom and Microsoft Teams, but for this session, if you would please mute your microphone. I'm sorry. Yes, please mute your microphone, and you can turn off your camera. The session will be recorded and it will be archived on the Connections Week webpage. Also, for those that need closed captions, let me guide you to that. So if you look on your toolbar in the More Options section, if you go to that area, whether you're using your phone or your computer, you'll see where it says live captions. You can turn it on or off. Then that way, everything that's being said, you can actually see it right there on your screen. Okay. And then also, please use the chat function to ask a question or to post a comment. And Professor White will be monitoring your comments. And so throughout the discussion, we will try to get to those questions and allow our panel to address them. Okay. And then near the end of this session, be on the lookout for a link where you will have the opportunity to provide feedback on the breakout, and that will also allow you to receive professional development for attending this session, and that will also be in the Learn Center. So if you don't see it near the end, please remind me. I'll try to remember to provide that link for you, okay? So I'm sure you have read an overview of this breakout, but just in case you did not, this is a professional development opportunity for TCC faculty and staff to further diversity awareness, knowledge, and skill sets, allowing for critical analysis of the services we provide and of the relational dynamics we seek in a diverse institution, but more specifically in the classroom. This panel will explore social justice via personal and institutional lenses to analyze power and privilege, discrimination and prejudice, inclusion and equity through the multiple social identities of race, gender, sexual orientation, class, nationality, ethnicity, ability, physical and mental, religion, etc. Ethnicity, I'm sorry. In hopes to enhance the skill sets of our faculty and staff as they welcome students back in the fall. Learn how to successfully integrate social justice issues into your curriculum and address structural inequalities in the digital classroom with a panel of esteemed scholars. Please be mindful that this is a safe space for healthy intellectual conversation surrounding social justice. Okay, so now that everyone is ready, let's meet our esteemed panel. So we have Dr. Sophia Fantas. She is an assistant professor of social work at the University of Texas in Arlington. Dr. Fantas studies LGBTQ health and reproduction, LGBTQ aging, moral distress, and the ethics of social work practice in the digital age. She serves as a biomedical ethicist at Houston Methodist Hospital, where she taught clinical ethics, research ethics, moral distress, and inclusive LGBTQ healthcare practice. Next, we have Dr. Ruth Lopez. She's an assistant professor of educational leadership and policy studies at the University of Houston. Dr. Lopez researches existing policies and practices that have implications for issues of equity and access in education. She studies how education policy information gets disseminated, how policies are implemented, and how they impact the communities they are designed to help. Next, we have Dr. Keaton Ramsey. He is an assistant professor of African American literature at the University of Texas in Arlington. Dr. Ramsey researches 20th and 21st century African American short fiction, hip hop, and book history. His ongoing digital humanities projects use data sets to illuminate the significance of recurring trends and thematic shifts as it relates Black writers and rappers. And lastly, we have Dr. Paul Eaton, Assistant Professor of Educational Leadership at Sam Houston State University. Dr. Eaton researches the impact of digital technologies on college student experiences, identity and subjectivity in the digital age, digital pedagogy, and educational philosophy. So please join me in giving a virtual round of applause for our panel. All right. Okay. So we have about a good, not quite 2 hours, but we have nearly 2 hours of a discussion here. And social justice may not be something that you teach in the classroom, but most certainly it is something that affects all of us. And so we're just going to take a little time today and address some of those topics. And our panel will express and share their views, their opinions. So we want to be open and receptive of what's going to be shared in this discussion. Also, keep in mind, this is a two-way conversation here. So as they are speaking, once again, if you have any questions, please drop it in the chat and we'll try to address those to the best of our ability. Okay. So I'm going to start out by just asking the panel, each one of them, to expand on their background and their bio, because I gave you just a little bit, and what I gave you, perhaps you were able to read that when you signed up for this breakout. But I'm going to ask each one to just expand, give a brief introduction, addressing their background in their areas of interest. Okay. So we will start with, ladies first, Dr. Lopez. Let's start with you.
Great. Sorry, I have the mute button was lagging a little bit. Hello, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here, and I'm just so excited. One reason why, and it's a little bit of who I am, is because I'm originally from the Dallas area. I grew up in the area of Pleasant Grove. I don't know if y'all have heard of it. And was educated in that community, raised there. My family still lives in that neighborhood. I'm a proud graduate of Skyline High School in the Dallas area. And so I am a first generation, I identify as a first generation college student. I was the first in my family to graduate from high school, but not the last, right? And so I've had a lot of family that have followed in those footsteps and have gone to college now. I also am the daughter of immigrants from Mexico and El Salvador. And so that has shaped a lot of the work that I do today and the communities that I serve. And so, yes, my work is around policy issues. A qualitative researcher, use a lot of kind of coming from an interdisciplinary approach. My background is in Mexican American Studies from UT Austin, sorry, probably UT Arlington there, and so I look at education really broadly, right, from the context piece. I look at issues of college access and how we are serving or not serving underrepresented groups in higher education and how we may not be preparing them adequately for higher education. I also look at the intersection of immigration policy and education policy. And so some of my work has looked at the DREAM Act, which would give access to residency eventually and citizenship eventually for undocumented young people. And so that's some of the work that I'm doing right now. I have a lot of interests and just so excited to be here. Thank you.
All right, excellent. Sorry, I had to go get a pencil real quick.
No worries.
All right, Dr. Fuentes, could you please share a little bit about your background?
Of course, and thank you, TCC, for putting this really important panel together. I'm really excited and honored to be here as well. So I come from a little bit further away. I'm Canadian. I got my bachelor's from the University of Toronto in religion and bioethics, then went to do a master's of social work at New York University, and then actually went back to Toronto because I missed Canada so much to complete a PhD in social work and bioethics. And then giving you a little bit of my trajectory, just because it's a little bit unique. I went out of academia and decided to go to Baylor College of Medicine to be a clinical ethicist at Houston Methodist Hospital, where I worked for the last 2 years. And obviously with talking about social justice and healthcare inequities, you see that every day in the ICUs, on the floors, with patients. And we cannot have this discussion without talking about, obviously, COVID-19 and its impacts on Black and Brown communities. So I just want to reiterate that as an ethicist working within the hospital system. And then just last summer, I moved up to Arlington to be an assistant professor in social work at UTA, where I've been for about a year. I teach diverse populations, and I've also taught death and dying for both undergrad and master's students. And my work focuses a lot on the LGBTQ plus community. So my work has expanded kind of across the lifespan. I've done a lot of bias-based bullying of LGBTQ youth, looking at cyberbullying as well. I've also looked at HIV prevention among men who have sex with men, and using online health outreach tools like Grindr and Jacked to encourage men to get tested with that. And then my dissertation was looking at gestational surrogacy for gay fathers. And so my move now has been about LGBTQ families and how COVID-19 has impacted LGBTQ families looking for access and equal access to reproductive care. So that's a little bit about my work. I'm also a qualitative researcher, dabble a little bit in mixed methods, but I just love interviews and talking to people and gaining insight into their lived experiences and raising the voices of those who have been so often marginalized, neglected, and silenced within research.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. Thank you. All right, Dr. Peaton.
All right. Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me this afternoon. Glad to be here. I am, again, an assistant professor of educational leadership at Sam Houston State University. I teach specifically in the Higher Education Administration program and the Higher Education Leadership program. So a lot of my work focuses on preparing people who are going to be working in various student services and administrative functions within colleges and universities. So I teach a lot of courses in curriculum theory, curriculum design, and educational philosophy. I also teach courses in diversity and culture issues in higher education. And my research is pretty broad in those areas. My dissertation looked at how college students utilized various different social media platforms to understand issues around identity and subjectivity, and how the digital space is impacting their experience with understanding identity and subjectivity issues. That's, of course, an important topic for colleges and universities to be thinking about. Since I've come out of my doctoral program 6 years ago, I've been doing research on digital professionalization and how digital tools give professionals in the field access to developing learning communities in digital space. I've also been doing research in an area called post-qualitative research. So like my two colleagues before, I am a qualitative researcher, but I'm trying to push qualitative research away from some of the kind of standard approaches to qualitative and looking at how we can think about doing research in different ways, particularly utilizing digital tools, photo inquiry, sound, things of this nature. So a lot of that kind of work. And then, like I said, I teach courses in our programs around diversity and culture issues in higher education and curriculum issues. I would consider myself a critical scholar, and that means that I try to structure those classes to look at how institutions of higher education reproduce structural power inequities, and how that's done through curriculum and how that's done through diversity initiatives on campus. So I've taught broad courses around that, and then I've taught specific courses around white privilege and how white students in higher education can think about their white privilege. I've also taught courses at the undergraduate level, specifically looking at the work of James Baldwin and how we can harness James Baldwin to understand issues around race, queerness, and social critique in the 21st century. So looking forward to the conversation this afternoon.
Thank you so very much. And then lastly, we have Dr. Ramsey.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Kenton Ramsey. I am an assistant professor of English and history at the University of Texas at Arlington. This is beginning my 6th year here, and I always used to start to say, hey, I'm so new to DFW, but I've looked up and I'm here 6 years, so I'm not the new guy anymore. Let me see. I hail from Jackson, Tennessee. I did my undergraduate education at Morehouse College, where I majored in English and philosophy. And I did my master's and PhD work at the University of Kansas. Go Jayhawks. Right now, let me see, my research, I study African-American short fiction. Particularly, I'm in this field called digital humanities. So I use, again, hey, here's this thing, quantitative and qualitative data. And particularly, I'm interested in constructing qualitative data sets about African-American literary history so that we might be able to interpret how decisions were made about what we read in classrooms, how often we read it, and basically what is this editor's role in this decision in terms of disseminating education. More recently, particularly in the last 3 years, I have been more so interested in collecting data about Black people online, particularly to think about misinformation and how communities of color are vulnerable to that. In particular, it was a study done by the Pew Institute in 2018 that showed people of color, particularly Black and brown people, are more likely to drive the growth of social media while not necessarily being the programmers or the people working with the actual technology. From 2016, we saw a concerted effort for communities of color to be subjected to disinformation, particularly to increase voter apathy. Right now, what I've been doing is literally collecting all of that data. And I think it's so timely right now to actually see what actual cities were targeted, what actual communities were targeted, particularly this idea of Black speech. We talk about the vernacular, the history of this, but Black speech, Black culture can be co-opted against people when online to be used to influence for different things. So that's really what I'm into now. It's an exciting and I think very timely area of research, because I'm using this idea about rhetoric, about language, to see how is it being shaped, how is it being used, and how can it literally move people. I also want to say I'm so happy to be here today because, you know, in undergrad, in graduate school, oftentimes people said, what can you do with a humanities major? What can you do with a humanities degree? And I would like to say right now in 2020, it seems like we are all in need of some humanity, and at least studying it as if it is a science of some sort. So I'm so excited, so humbled to be here talking about humanity.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. So for those that are sitting in this audience, you are in for a surprise. You have heard from 4 scholars. I can't wait. Let's just jump right into this, all right? And this is for anybody. There are a lot of preconceived ideas around the term social justice. So, like I said, this is for anyone on the panel. So share with us, what does social justice mean to you? What does it mean to you when you hear that term? And Dr. Ramsey, we'll start with you since you was the last. Let's go ahead and start with you because I hear a lot of energy coming from you. So go ahead.
All right. Well, thanks. I'll get it started. Well, people have a variety of definitions for social justice, but often people define it in formal ways as relating to equal rights, equal opportunity, equal treatment. As someone who studies African American literature and history, it often connects to how Black people or Black Americans are treated in many different facets of American society. So people would push for social justice, meaning equal opportunities or equal treatment in education and how in the judicial system and so forth. In my classes on African American Lit, we end up talking about terms and their inverses. So while we're talking about social justice, I really think it's important that we consider, at least in our minds, what is social injustice. So we discuss slavery and we discuss freedom. We talk about troubles caused by racism, and then we talk about the benefits of cultural affirmation, i.e. something like Beyonce's Black is King. We think about education and healthcare disparities. We think about generational wealth. We think about birth mortality rate. Particularly at the last of this semester, we started thinking about what would have been happening in an equitable society with access to resources in the outbreak of COVID. So to really understand social justice, it's sometimes good to consider what injustice looks like. Otherwise, social justice seems odd or empty. And for me, I found it's helpful to consider what unequal education consists of. What does a lack of opportunity involve? What does the absence of rights with the respect to the judicial system actually mean? So addressing those issues assists us in understanding more when it comes to social justice. So again, I think to sum this all up, social justice is talking about, again, access to treatment, but I like to think about the inverse of these things. What is social justice, but what is also injustice?
Right. Dr. Francis, I see you shaking your head. You want to jump in?
I'll jump in. I agree. And I'm going to move away from let's say a definition base. And I would say I can't think about social justice, especially in the classroom, without recognizing and acknowledging my own white privilege. I can't acknowledge and talk about social justice without recognizing my own assumptions and biases, the neighborhood I grew up in, the educational system that I was trained and educated in and grew up in. I was born into white supremacy, and my unearned privileges have afforded me a lifetime of, where I am today, pretty much, and the opportunities that have been afforded to me. And so when I talk about diverse populations, and when I talk even in my death and dying class, I cannot start a class without acknowledging and talking about whiteness. And I think sometimes we want to shy away from that, right? That idea of white fragility, that idea of, well, we don't want to talk about that. We want to focus on racism and systemic racism and individual racism. And let's talk about all the burdens and hardships. But with that, we have to acknowledge whiteness and how white privilege plays a role in that. And then to assume and take on what is important for us. So what that looks like, how do we educate ourselves instead of continuously asking people of color to educate us about it? How can we look for the resources and the opportunities that we need in order to effectively teach in the classroom without continuously relying on marginalized communities to do that for us? And so I think when we think about social justice, I'm always just attuned to ideas of white privilege and white supremacy within that. And then also the idea of intersectionality. I can't talk about social justice, especially with an LGBTQ plus lens. And for those who don't know, I apologize. It's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning. And the plus is for all those identities that don't fit into the LGBTQ original acronym. I should have said that at the beginning. But, during COVID-19 and after George Floyd's killing, there was a lot, obviously, the BLM protests, but it was during the month of Pride as well. And I just kept remembering how Stonewall and Pride started as a protest. And it was started by Black trans women of color, who were the first women to throw the bricks to start a movement. And the intersections of gender, sexuality, race, age, ethnicity, language is just so essential to us talking about it and talking about ways in which to confront social justice. So those are a little bit of my ideas about social justice.
Thank you. Now Dr. Peaton, and I heard you say earlier that you've done some extensive studies as it pertains to white privilege and queerness. Can you perhaps expand on that for our audience? I think oftentimes people hear the term white privilege, but maybe they're not quite clear really what that means.
Yeah, so when we are talking to students in the classroom about white privilege, you often will get students who will especially white students, white male students in true particular, to be very specific, building on what Dr. Fantis was saying, they become defensive because people hear the word white privilege and they think that means that you're saying that they've never experienced any hardships in their life, right? And there is this real difficulty of getting students in a classroom or getting people in general to understand that when we're talking about something like privilege, we are partially talking about individual bias, and maybe we're talking about what I would call individual acts of racism, right? Using profane language, doing discriminatory actions, right? But that's how we often think about racism in this country, is through individual acts. White privilege is about a system, like Dr. Fantis was talking about, right? It's about how you get access to certain types of experiences, how you will not have access to certain types of experiences. To talk a little bit about what Dr. Ramsey was talking about, this idea that, we often will look at, oh, this is the bad thing that has happened to this community, right? This marginalized community. And that's important, but we don't often look at what is the opposite of that. What is the positive thing that happened to the person in the power position? So that's what you have to do when you're trying to explain to students about how white privilege works, is you have to try to get them to think in systems. Building on the question, one of the things that I have spent a lot of time in my classes, particularly with students who are going to go into administration, curriculum theory classes, we talk about these issues around how white privilege, cisgender privilege, religious privilege in the United States around Christianity, how these things get reproduced, for example, through curricular structurings, right? And how the things that we're teaching in the classroom, the courses that we're offering, the things that we're banning, all of this kind of stuff, how do those privileges get reproduced through the ways that we structure curriculum, through the ways that we structure the co-curricular? And I'm heavily influenced also by this idea that we also have to be critical in institutions that just because we are offering something doesn't mean that it necessarily always has a social justice lens. There's a theorist that I study a lot, Roderick Ferguson, and he talks about the ways that institutions have co-opted this language of social justice and co-opted certain types of movements, brought them into the institution in order to shut down their radical potentiality, right? So I spend a lot of time talking with students about how just because we might be teaching a course in, for example, Black studies, doesn't mean that the institution cares about Black lives, right? Or just because we have an LGBT campus center doesn't mean that the institution actually cares about queer students at all, right? I mean, the act that something is there in an institution doesn't mean the institution actually cares about that thing. So we have to spend a lot of time kind of breaking down for students how that can be a possibility in the institution. I don't know if I
So-
answered your question, but
Oh, so you touched on the classroom. So Dr. Lopez, I'm coming to you next. um, and as educators and having been in the classroom, I don't know down in Houston. Well, I used to live there, so I know Houston is a very diverse city. Could you maybe share with us what are some of the implications, as we take this into the classroom? Let's say you have a class that is, as Dr. Peden may have mentioned, let's say you have a classroom that is full of white males, or you have a class of one particular population. How do we take this into the classroom as we are all building our syllabi and our lecture notes? How do we take this into a 16-week course?
Yeah. And I actually had a few responses about social justice, and they actually fit nicely with what I'm about to say here too. So, yeah, U of H doesn't look like that, right? We are 36% Latinx, but I have taught in Boulder. I went to the University of Colorado Boulder, and I taught an undergrad class where that was the situation. So hearing Dr. Eaton talk, I just was nodding because that was the population of students I was engaged in. I was teaching education, and I think when you do have that population, I also teach in a K-12 I teach in an educational leadership department similar to Dr. Eaton, and I'm teaching K-12 administrators. And so if these administrators, may not look like me, maybe they've never had a Latina professor sitting in front of them, for one thing, right? Oftentimes they haven't had someone that looks like me as a professor. And so within that field, and this could be applied to numerous fields, right? These students are getting trained to go out and support communities that may not look like them. And so I see it as a responsibility to start engaging them in conversations that may not be comfortable, because they're going to go out there and, in my case, lead schools of children that look just like me, of Black and brown children. And I think I would be negligent if we don't talk about deficit framing of these communities, and really try to reframe and push asset-based framing of these communities, what's already there. Because so often what's been pushed in the media has been this deficit lens and stereotypes, and that's unfortunately what they come in with, but that's the education they've gotten. And also borrowing from the other panelists about what's in the curricula, that's what they've been taught. So I think a lot of what I do in the classroom is unlearning. Some of my students have come back and say, I can't look at things the same, because my students are full-time practitioners. So they go back into the classroom after they've been reading critical race theory and feminist thought. And so they come back and they say, this program has kind of messed me up, because now I see all these things I didn't see before. But I really think that's a privilege in my position, because they are able to have these theoretical sort of grappling and thinking about social justice, and then they're able to turn around and go the next day to their schools and actually put it into practice. And so that's one thing I really love. Just a couple of things I think I try to push to my students is that social justice isn't temporary. Like, we can't just do an intervention and then call it a day. It's forever. And sometimes that's exhausting. But I think a lot of times institutions with these different initiatives we see for diversity, they want to see outcomes. They want to see in 5 years what happened. But that's not going to work. We have to keep these interventions forever. It's also about action. So not just reading all these amazing books about walking the talk. We can talk it all day long and it sounds beautiful. But how do we implement it? So that's what I'm talking to my students about too, is how do you actually go do this in real life? How do you speak up in those meetings where everyone's looking at each other because someone said something racist and problematic, right? And then the last thing I'll say is that in the classroom, it's pretty, I can predict it. It's gonna get asked sometimes by even students of color, but Professor Lopez or Dr. Lopez, isn't it class more than race? And so what I try to disrupt is this binary thinking and getting away from this either or mentality. And I think that ties to what Dr. Fontes was saying about intersectionality, right? About both and really disrupting. I think that's something that's also been pushed a lot in the dominant society, is this either or, fighting for the crumbs kind of mentality. a professor of mine used to call it the battle of the oppression Olympics, right? And so that's something that also makes my students very uncomfortable, because I was educated in Texas too, and in the American school system that tries to teach us that there's an answer for everything. And so that's, I think, something that we can engage in the classroom, and something that sometimes students are not ready to do. But the last thing I'll say is that one way that I've done this is through critical reflection, through their own writing, exploring their stories. Sometimes my white students say, well, I'm just normal. I just grew up normal, so I don't have anything to write about. And I'm like, you know what? Just do the prompt. They say this before they've even seen the prompt. And do the prompt, go, and it's going to be a conversation between me and you. And then I got this idea from a friend, but we call it an iterative critical autobiography. So as they read more about these social justice issues in the class, they go back and through track edits, they rewrite some of what they used to think, or how they've been pushed through the readings in the class and the conversation. And some of my students say, well, like, wow, I've never told anyone about this before. I didn't realize that I had gone through this until I actually wrote about it. And so that's, I think, one powerful way, allowing students to tell their stories, and even if they're a little resistant to it, giving them the space to go there and to be messy about it, letting them mess up in this classroom, because the last thing I want is for them to mess out when they're in front of the children that they need to be teaching and thinking really highly of.
So it sounds like that you are comfortable with making your students uncomfortable.
Oh, 100%.
So they can push through that to then come back to being in a state of comfort. And sometimes that comfort is going to look different, is going to feel different, but I think you it sounds like you're that professor that says, I'm going to challenge you, and we're going to step outside of our comfort zones for a minute here, but we're going to reel this back in. Dr. Peden, did you have your hand up? Okay, come on.
Yeah, I want to see, like, now we're getting into it, right? Yeah. So, like, we all going to start talking. Like, I think one of the things that Dr. Lopez said, and this is actually a problem, and it's I frame it as a problematic with my students, and this is particularly true in education, right? The way that education is structured is that we do everything in these, like, time-stamped increments, right? A 15-week term, okay? And students come into my class, and it's their one diversity class, and I tell them on day one, hey, we are talking about this little aspect of diversity, because what can I teach you about diversity, culture, privilege, oppression, all of the stuff in 15 weeks. Right. So don't think that you're walking out of here in 15 weeks, fully competent as a multicultural professional or whatever the case is, right? All I'm doing is I'm giving you a set of questions and tools that you might use to go out, and this is lifelong work, right? One of the problems when we start talking about this is that we get this, like, checkbox mentality in education. We get this checkbox mentality in society too, right? Where we think, oh, if we just do this, the problem is solved. It's over, right? We just pass some civil rights legislation and somehow racism is gone, right? Or we just pass some kind of, like, whatever program, we just build a resource center for students, we build a course about this, and that problem is solved. And that's not how any of this works, right? It's like, that's actually the first step. And then we've got to build on that to kind of, like, take down the system that forced us into that position to begin with. That's what I try to get my students to think about when they walk out of my class, is that I didn't teach you anything. I just set you on a path, and you're never going to reach the end of the path. And that's really hard for students sometimes, because they think, oh, in 15 weeks, I should know everything about diversity and culture. You don't know anything after 15 weeks.
So how do we combat this social media catastrophe that occurs on a daily basis, when we recognize as scholars that we can't make you experts in 15 weeks, but at the same time, we do expect you to take this information and do better? But we know what they're up against. You talked about the digital tools, I think, a little bit earlier. I think our audience would be interested in knowing, like, what type of digital tools. Dr. Rams, I'm going to come to you as well, because I know that you have this digital learning platform that it seems like that, man, I've your students, I know they have to appreciate, but Dr. Pete, so what are these digital tools? What help our audience understand, like give them an example of what you're referring to.
Okay.
Oh,
yeah, and I'm just going to say one thing, right? One of the problems that we have, I think, with social media right now is that people always frame social media in a deficit way. They think that social media has destroyed our society. And in some ways, that there's plenty of evidence to support that. But I always build social media projects into my classes because I try to tell students that, in fact, this is the greatest educative tool that we have at our disposal. And I want to teach you how to use something like Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, TikTok, whatever the latest thing is, to be able to advance a social justice agenda and not to cut down or spread misinformation. So there's a digital literacy issue here that I think is really important. And I don't think that we should always, as educators, just dismiss social media as a danger, right? There's a lot of potential with it. And I'd rather us harness that than harness the danger.
Right. Excellent. Dr. Ramsey.
Oh yeah, I gotta agree with that. First off, like I do think that we are looking at social media sometimes as a bad tool, but I could also point to the National Enquirer and say we kind of didn't get that same sort of outrage about it. But I think this is where this idea of the humanities comes in with critical scholarship, critical thinking skills. It's something that we necessarily can't, quantify in terms of how much money you will make by being a critical thinker. But this is where critical thinking comes in particularly. I do make my students aware of social media, particularly just like Dr. P, not implement different types of essays, multi-module essays, because I'm an English professor and I got to be for real with you. I don't know how oftentimes a lot of people are going to be asked to write research papers on their jobs. However, I have seen oftentimes that companies hire people, and I love this little phrase, oh, the young people know social media. We're going to get them to just, do some social media posts for this company. But oftentimes students I've run into do not know how necessarily, write short, write brief, and still be very explanatory in terms of the way that they're writing. With that being said, I try to show my students how can we write memes that invite people into conversations and then link them to other things. As an English professor, we're always talking about cite their sources, but when you're actually composing things in online audiences, I can go directly to your source. So again, this is some of the types of things that I'm thinking about. How do we evaluate a source? Are some blogs sometimes better than some sites that have a .org type of website address? So these are the types of things that I look for in particular. But really, I really like focusing on the language part when we're thinking about social media, because as I point out, language is the last way we can openly discriminate against people and not necessarily call it a bad thing. So for instance, if I came in this session like, what up, y'all? What's been going on? What up, Shawty? I'm from ATL, blase, blase, blah. People might take a step back and say a professor speaking in this language. However, the idea is on social media, we tend to gravitate to stuff that is more like our discourses, internal discourses, than opposed to those discourses. So basically, I'm thinking about how do we use language? How does language appeal to us? How do we repel away from different things? And I don't necessarily know if I don't want to think about the digital tools, but I do want to think to sum all of this up, the economy of time and space in a digital world. Because a picture is worth 1,000 words, and oftentimes we project onto meanings more so than we actually interpret. So again, humanities and critical thinking key.
Wow. All right. Got me over here sweating. Man, that's some good information you all are imparting there. So,
can I just add?
Yes,
and just jump
please.
into the conversation?
Yes.
So I agree that social media is hugely powerful and hugely helpful. I know for me, going back to talking about white privilege and whiteness, I try to bring in guest lectures and diverse voices. And with that, there's a lot of podcasts, TED Talks, videos out there to bring into the classroom. I have a list if we get into more specifics, but one of my favorites is Teaching While White, which it's a book, it's a podcast. It is amazing. It's really helpful to kind of not only educate your class, but also educate yourself if you are a white faculty member trying to bring diversity and inclusion into the classroom. I also have a list of like many others. So I think podcasts and social media and multimedia is just hugely important, especially in the classroom when people do not want to sit and listen to a lecture for like 3 hours. But my social work brain also wants to say one thing that we always have to keep in the back of our mind is access. So who has access to Wi-Fi? Who has access to digital literacy, to tools, to laptops, to computers? I know that when we went online very, very quickly in March, we had a lot of students who wrote to us to say, I don't have access to my personal laptop. I share it with like 5 of my siblings. We all get maybe an hour with it, and all the libraries are closed. You know, you can't really go outside because of safety concerns. And, you know, how am I going to do my homework? How am I going to be involved? And so I think as faculty members, we always want to make sure too that our students, not to, I guess, coerce students to disclose, you know, what might be a very personal or distressing situation to them, but know that our students may come from diverse backgrounds, and to know that their access to, you know, digital communication, to technology, to all that might be a barrier. And with that comes also ideas of safety. So I know, especially, and I'm talking about the queer community right now, but especially with LGBTQ youth, they may not be out to their parents. And so this is obviously about service and a little bit beyond education, but it might roll into the classroom where they're allowed a certain hour, but they don't want to watch a podcast on LGBTQ lives because it's unsafe to do so within their home. They might not want to watch something about the BLM movement because it's unsafe to do that in their home. And so we also have to think about health and mental health issues and safety concerns around our students as well when they use technology where it might not be safe. We might have these assumptions as faculty members that everybody has access to Wi-Fi now, everybody has a smartphone, everybody has a laptop or a computer, but that's really, really not true. And we just have to keep that, I think, always at the forefront of our minds when we start using technology within the classroom, and especially now with COVID-19, as more and more classes are moving online and transitioning to online. I think we're going to see a big achievement gap with folks, and I think we have to make sure that there are multimedia approaches, but also a diversity of flexibility and understanding for those who may not have access and equal access.
So you touched on something earlier, and you mentioned COVID. Mm-hmm. So it was 100 years ago that this country experienced a pandemic. And so we all are experiencing this pandemic. Speak about the impact of COVID on minority populations, and we're including LGBTQ populations as well. Speak to that, the impact, because this is new to all of us.
I can start, and then I'd love to pass it to my colleagues. I think, you know, we've seen the disproportionate numbers, right? And it's based on, we can talk for days about how it's based on systemic racism, right? Environmental racism, densely populated neighborhoods, segregated neighborhoods, school systems, why Black and Brown communities are at a disproportionate impact to COVID-19, whether it's trust in the healthcare system that has disproportionately not believed and has been racist against Black and Brown communities, especially women of color who are disbelieved when they have pain or have other symptoms, especially pregnant women of color. So there's obviously huge systems in place that have further perpetuated sort of the ways in which COVID-19 has impacted communities of color. But I think for specifically with my focus on LGBTQ folks, you know, COVID-19 hit in March, and, you know, Pride was put online. And so, like I said before, for LGBTQ youth living in unsafe environments at home, Pride was really a month where they were able to seek support, seek mentors, establish communities, all without their parents knowing. And suddenly all of that was taken away from them. And so they're stuck in their homes where, unfortunately, Texas is one of the biggest providers of conversion therapy or reparative therapy. And that has undeniable health and mental health harms on LGBTQ youth. So put that where they are stuck at home in an environment that is unsupportive and unhelpful, and then maximize that with fears of being placed in conversion therapy or being forced to seek treatment for their LGBTQ identity. LGBTQ aging in older adults. as well. They are high risk at both. They are LGBTQ and they're an older adult population, fears of safety and health regarding COVID-19, who have higher rates of depression, health and mental health issues, disability. And so they're stuck at home, not really great with the digital, with the digital divide in terms of age gap and generational gap, and then stuck at home and not sure how to communicate or get food or get access to certain things. And so I think that we really need to kind of consider ways in which to reach out to the LGBTQ community. Many folks don't know, but those folks who have been untested before for HIV or STIs, Pride is one of the main times that they will get tested because there's mobile testing sites around that are anonymous. So without Pride, there are less ways in which to seek access to health and mental health services because of that. And so I think for the LGBTQ community, Pride, the dismantling almost of an in-person Pride exacerbated by COVID-19 and worries around HIV, STIs, and a distrust of the medical system, because the medical system for so long has been discriminated and stigmatized against LGBTQ folks from the AIDS epidemic until now. There's fears about going to seek healthcare, going to a family physician, going to make sure that they're okay and getting checked because of years of stigmatization. And so we always have to keep in the back of our mind that LGBTQ folks are at risk of COVID, but at risk of so much more because of COVID.
Right.
I kind of want to jump into and talk a little bit about what's up about being at risk at COVID. And I kind of want to make this a little bit of a personal story, but not looking for sympathy, because I think oftentimes when we hear that, COVID affects Black communities and that Black people are dying, brown people are dying, we sometimes hear that as a sound bite. So when we're walking into faculty meetings, walking to different things, or not faculty meetings, virtual meetings, we're saying, oh, I hope your family's safe. But I don't necessarily know if we take into account how many people are actually dying. So when this was actually going on, the beginning of COVID, I lost 6 people in 40 days. And it's kind of one of those things where I was able to get the idea about how older people say funerals are not for the person who's dead, but they're for the person who's living. And, just about the trauma of not being able to actually go to a funeral, actually say goodbye to people. People at funerals, you'll probably see, you'll probably never see again in life. So I think about those things. However, I sometimes think there is still this expectation put to, of course, come on, be in the community and act accordingly. Now, as I was over here saying, woe is me, in the first 40 days, I lost 5 people. So many of my students, again, UTA, it's the 5th most diverse school in the nation. And I will say, I see that a lot in my classroom. As a result of that, many of my students were shell-shocked simply because they could not deal with the trauma of losing people. And I want to always make sure we put a little bit more emphasis on the people here left behind sometimes. And particularly when financial pillars in your life happen to succumb to COVID and you have to start making a lot of different decisions about how you live. Again, these are some of the issues I really want us to also think about, the emotional trauma of this, because, we have mentioned, I've heard a couple of times, even with Dr. Peter, we've mentioned James Baldwin and stuff, but to be, in a true literary frame, we do have to think about mental health and necessarily how we are thinking about with our minds in particular things. I think about James Baldwin wrote so much about his father, seemingly to have gone crazy from racism, after witnessing his brother die and these types of things. And what effect does that have on him as a father to James Baldwin? Well, what effect does this have on students who are coming to, learn remotely? What effect does this have on colleagues who are coming to actually have to plan funerals and actually do lesson plans as well? So I do want us to think about the people left behind, the people who are still trucking, the people who are taking care of their families doing this, because oftentimes, or at least when I was in graduate school and even in more so graduate school, I did notice that there was a difference on why people were at school sometimes. People were at school sometimes to provide a way for their family, to be a light for their family. So I want us to think sometimes people in school are typically, in families particularly, are, they're there as one person, but really they represent so many other people. So I want us to think about that too, how we think about COVID has really, affected people.
Thank you.
Well, and I would just add to that, our institutions are just not equipped. I'll just be blunt. Like the institution I work at total failure right now, including at the start of the academic term, to be able to handle, for example, the emotional trauma that's associated with all of these people dying, or just the emotional trauma of having, like Dr. Fantis was saying, your community taken away from you, right? Because you can't go to Pride, or you can't, you know, even this summer when the marches were going on, I was talking to students who were having to make very difficult decisions about, is it socially responsible for me to go and protest in the streets, knowing that potentially that could expose me to COVID, or maybe I'm gonna, you know, there's all kinds of things that our students are dealing with. The financial stuff, the food insecurity, the housing insecurity as evictions start to go up. If your family has, you know, lost their jobs or whatever the case is, students might be homeless. Are institutions prepared to take those students into residence halls, other facilities, to be able to provide them with just basic human needs so that they can come into our classroom and be academically successful? I don't know that our institutions are prepared to deal with that. The whole summer has been just so much about trying to get the institution back open that we haven't really taken the time to think about all of the potential impacts of what needs to happen down the line. That's been very disappointing as a higher ed administrator for me to witness that. So if you're in the classroom, you've got to be prepared. Like, this is the first week of class for us. I'm sending a survey to all my students. What are your issues? Just tell me any issue that you might be having. It could be everything from, yo, I'm homeschooling my, you know, kids and, you know, trying to do this and taking care of a sick parent, and my husband or my partner lost their job and we don't have enough food, and there's just so many things. We have to be responsible for that as faculty, because I don't think our institutions are going to take on that responsibility.
So for those that may have just joined us, this breakout is titled Social Justice Within the Classroom. And we have Dr. Peaton from Sam Houston State. We have Dr. Ramsey from UTA. We have Dr. Fantis from the UTA. And we also have Dr. Lopez from the University of Houston. And so there's been some great dialogue here regarding the implications of recently, the implications of COVID in a lot of our communities. But we've also been addressing some of the parameters as it pertains to social justice, and what does it mean to us, our students, and then how do we move past this? So what I want to do is move into a couple other questions, because Dr. Peaton, you mentioned something that kind of grabbed my attention, that sometimes our institutions aren't necessarily doing a fantastic job or doing anything as it pertains to this. What do you say to our audience when they want to step out on that limb, but they are afraid? Like they want to say the word racism, but they don't want, I don't know, just somebody talk about that.
I'm going to let some others chime in, but I'm going to say one thing. I always tell people what Audre Lorde says: your silence will not protect you. Okay? The institution doesn't care about you, so you have to make the institution care about you, and your silence is not going to protect you. So say the word racism, say the word anti-Blackness, right? It's not, I'm really into right now this idea of specificity. Going back to the question that you opened with, Dr. Sabir, about what does social justice mean, I really want people to not get caught in taking language and making it non-performative, right? Be specific. Say white privilege, say anti-Blackness, say queer violence, say racial violence instead of microaggression, right? When something happens in the classroom, just call it what it is. That helps us to really get into actually talking about what it is that we need to do to change the institutions.
Excellent.
I would say too, just to chime in, that I think it's really important for all faculty members to go, and I've talked about this before, go through a process of self-reflexivity. If you are scared, or you're scared of administration, or you're scared of saying the words out loud, I would really encourage, and it's a really hard process, right? Nobody wants to like sit with their self-reflection and sit inside and acknowledge your own implicit biases and explicit biases and assumptions and attitudes and values. But just like Dr. Lopez has said before, I ask my students to do a self-reflection essay at the beginning of class, and I bring in intersectionality, and we have to talk about the intersecting identities, the ways in which privilege and oppression has, impacted their lives. And just as I ask my students to do that, I need to do that myself before I step into the classroom. I need to acknowledge all those things if I'm going to come with transparency and honesty and integrity. And just like Dr. Eaton had said too, this is a lifelong journey. I always tell my students too, we're going to mess up in this classroom, but it is a classroom of learning and, trying to be accepting of one another. And I might screw up as well. I might make a mistake. I might say something that is incorrect or wrong. And I encourage my students to call me out on that and to show me where it is so I can learn as well. Because I rely on my students to teach me as much as I teach them. Because as Dr. Ramsey has said, UTA is a very, very diverse school. And we have a lot of veterans in our community. We have a lot of people of color, and they have so many more lived experiences than I do. And they have so much more to teach me sometimes than I have to teach them. And so I really try and make it a reciprocal learning environment, and to put as much sort of empowerment on students to teach me, and for it to be a collaborative environment. But I really encourage that, as well as acknowledging your own self-reflexivity. If there is an idea that you are scared or discouraged or don't want to name racism, violence, microaggressions, whatever names or labels you want to use, then I really encourage you to look deep inside of you of where that fear is coming from, where that scaredness is coming from, where that hesitancy is coming from. Because I guarantee, maybe not always, but I guarantee it's not really the administration, it's what's lying underneath, where the administration is used almost as a tool to say, well, I don't want to deal with this. Well, I don't want to talk about it. And so I would say that that's a really, really important exercise to do before you even step into a classroom.
Now, I can't imagine anybody calling you out on anything, but I understand what you're saying, that you don't know it all. And because we all bring our own cultures and languages and experiences, that you're open and receptive to something else that perhaps you haven't heard before, learning. And I think that's profound to think about. And we all are sitting here with doctorate degrees, but yet someone may walk into that classroom with less than an associate's, and they could teach us. And I think that's highly, highly admirable for you to say. But I think we all are probably in agreement that there's just so much that's out there. Now, I want to give Dr. Lopez an opportunity, because I know there's some perhaps some social justice strategies that maybe she uses in the classroom. I know down at University of Houston, well, I don't know all of the programs, but is there any particular programs or departments, anything that you can maybe share with the audience?
That are social justice focused, you mean? Or
something similar. I know most institutions have diversity and inclusion, but just going a step beyond that.
Yeah, we have, and I don't do a lot of the work, but I'm one of those people that when I do come to campus, I try to at least know what services are available, right? And so the Center for Diversity and Inclusion, I know in the past have done training like for DACA, like how to support your undocumented students, and staff, students, faculty were invited to those. I also ended up bringing undocumented student group to called the Youth Empowerment Alliance, brought them to my college, the College of Education, to do a staff and faculty training. And that was the first time that they had ever done something like that. What happened is that I was approached and asked, if I could be the point person for undocumented students for our college. Gets asked of faculty of color to be the representative, right? And I said, actually, I have a better idea. Why don't we all get trained so that we can, know how to serve this community, because we all have to be trained. And at the University of Houston, we probably have estimates about 1,000 undocumented students. And then within my program, we have I teach critical issues in urban education. And so we touch a lot on this. But I think one thing I was kind of thinking about, and I kept thinking with that previous question, I think it ties into this question too, is that, I kind of keep picturing these conversations of like, I think you had shared the question earlier of how do you express regret, sorrow, empathy when you see something like this happening? And I thought about both as a colleague, right? So maybe there's folks watching here that are faculty and staff, and you may have faculty and staff colleagues that you might have wanted to express some of these thoughts to, but also, of course, in the classroom, right? And I think a couple of things that I've thought about within my own personal interactions as a light-skinned Latina, and I try to acknowledge for sure my positionality in the classroom, and there's been times when I've taught a class of all Black students. And I addressed that elephant in the room the first day. I am a light-skinned Latina, and I'm here teaching a classroom of all Black students. And so, I love the specificity. We have to be specific. And honestly, that wasn't part of how I was raised. I was raised to be quiet and be nice, and not say anything, even when it was happening in front of us. And I really am. It's a process of unlearning, and it's been quite liberating as well. And so when everything was happening with the death of George Floyd, I mean, he was from 3rd Ward, which is like blocks away from where I am currently sitting. And Vanessa Guillen, the Fort Hood soldier, was from down the street. And it's a school that I used to work in as a college outreach counselor. So these issues are, hitting us in the face. And so in those moments, I thought about my friends that might be my Black community, right? My friends that might be going through something. And yeah, I express sorrow, right? In my own self, right? Like, oh, I feel bad. But then I took the extra step of like texting or calling and not saying, hey, can you tell me how you're feeling? No, it's not about that. I just wanted to say, like, as a Latina, I do not understand what you're going through. I have my own ways that I'm experiencing and that I've experienced racism, but it's a very unique and different way. And I'm not going to try to say we're in the same boat. And I think that's what happens sometimes is that people want to lump us in the same, I'm going through this the same way that you are. No, we're going through it in very different ways. We're mourning in very different ways that are valid ways to mourn. And so I think that's important too. Just like they come to me when we hear about the issues happening with the family and child detention in the border, right? And they want to know what they could do. So I think it's about sharing in each other's humanity, really, and not trying to say like, I know what you're going through, because oftentimes we don't know what that other person is going through. So it's just kind of, I don't know how scholarly that is, but it's just things that I try to do as a person, right? The other thing I think that sometimes rubs me the wrong way is when people say like, I want to pick your brain about something, and without like acknowledging all the education I've gone through to get to this point. And so I love like these kinds of panels, right, where we're acknowledging the expertise that people bring. And so I think right now in this moment of like Black Lives Matter, of acknowledging racial injustice, there's also like a tendency to ignore all of the work that has been done. And I appreciate how all the panelists have referred to James Baldwin and other scholars that have laid the foundation for why we're here today and that we can pull from. And so one thing I told a colleague recently was that, I think sometimes there tends to be an erasure of all the work that's been done. So I think sometimes it's acknowledgement, like, okay, now I've arrived, I see that there's an issue. Let me educate myself on everything that's been done. Because sometimes that erasure can also be really dehumanizing as well. So doing the work, being okay with like saying you don't know what to say, but acknowledging, I think it's better than not saying anything at all. And I'm sorry, I think I went sideways, but with that, I think that's something that's been going on. We're having these conversations in our college, in our department, at all levels. They're important as colleagues and also in the classroom. Like they can't be separate.
I want to actually add something with Dr. Lopez what Dr. Lopez said. Actually, that was really great. And I really want to touch on the point where you said about not knowing what people are going through. Well, 2 points, not knowing what people are going through and positionality. Because as I talked about UTA being one of the most diverse schools in terms of student population, on the professor side, it is absolutely not diverse. And I want to use that to talk about positionality for a particular minute. I am an untenured Black male professor in Texas. I pick my battles very wisely in terms of what I speak up on and what I don't speak up about. And not because I am not engaged, not because I am not necessarily, like really feeling some sort of way to want to change things or passionate about it, but I do have to think about strategies. Now, with that being said, I've also been in the position where many students come to my office who are not English majors whatsoever, particularly many Black male students come to my office. And one of the reasons I don't trip or get mad about it is because I think about how often in my undergraduate and graduate school education that I did these types of things. So I'm saying that to say this in some types of ways. When you see the Black guy sitting in the room, you know what I'm saying? Not necessarily not disengaged, not necessarily not having an attitude. I had to speak to one of my colleagues one day to explain one fact because she wanted all of her students to write a reflection about social justice and what it's meant, and she knows the Black kids did not read theirs. I was not surprised by any means sometimes. And I sometimes wonder, well, who needs to have the in-depth social awakening about naming racism? So in some instances, I'm not necessarily saying that we don't need to necessarily get to a point of having discussions about it, but I don't want us to sometimes look at students and misperceive that because they're not speaking out or because they're not seeming engaged, is that they're not really pressing these issues. Because depending on how you all meet me, as Dr. Ramsey or as Kenton in his athleisure wear, you might perceive me differently. You might perceive me differently. And I do want to say that necessarily about particularly our students and our colleagues being attuned to like where they are, because I'm the grandson of a domestic worker, so me even still traveling to a university campus is still a different space in terms of socialization. So I want us to really think about that in terms of our students.
So
yeah, and can I just say something building off of that too, is that I think it's really important for you to think, when we're thinking about our positionality, is to think about when you show up, right? If you only show up and reach out to your Black colleague, for example, when another Black person has been gunned down by the police, that's not showing up for social justice, right? You have to show up every day if you're going to stand up for Black lives. I think about this a lot with, going back to what you were saying about sometimes we don't speak up about things. I'm an out and I'm a queer faculty member, okay? Perfectly fine with that, perfectly proud of it. But I'll tell you, I'm very leery and hesitant about putting anything about queer studies on my syllabus every term, because the minute I build in a unit that has anything to do with queerness, LGBT issues, whatever the case is, even if it's one article, you sometimes get a student in your class who says, like a evaluation that I got my first year, this whole class was about LGBT issues. Well, it wasn't, right? Because you knew I was gay, you thought the whole class was about LGBT issues. We read one article in 1 week of a 15-week term. You know what I'm saying? So it's like you also have to think about your own, when you're building curriculum, when you're building things into your class, you have to think about not just what your own identity is, but also what identities are you not and how are you building that in, and how do you sometimes have to take up the labor for other people who can't take the labor up because it's threatening to them or it's violent to them, right? That whole thing of like, I can't educate you about everything about the queer community because I only know one little facet of it. Black people can't educate me about everything about racism so we've all got to do that kind of labor in the classroom.
So once again, for those that may have just come in, if you would, because I'm noticing some comments in the chat that we do want to acknowledge. Our Professor Karina is taking a look at some of those. So as she's looking at those, if there's anything that we just want to take a second to somewhat address, we'll go ahead and do that.
Yeah, it looks like they're just all positive comments. Thanks for the good advice, and I didn't think about that before. Early on in our conversation, Jessica Cox wanted Dr. Fantas's information so she could reach out to her. I know the other doctors have shared that.
Okay. And pretty much all of their information is available. So we'll make sure that if there's something that you don't have, that we'll try to get it to you. And then also keep in mind that this discussion is being recorded. So if you are coming in late, that's okay. It will be posted at a later time on our Connections Week webpage. So you will have the opportunity to catch up on the information that perhaps you didn't receive. So are there any other comments that we can address?
Can I jump into the conversation?
Yes, please go ahead.
If you,
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I agree. I think, in talking about sort of putting queer and LGBTQ stuff in a syllabus, it's challenging. I'm going to give an international perspective here because I want to bring in some sort of Canadian perspective. But, in Canada, my work was, recognized. I had a community. It was, there was no point of not talking about it. And then when I went to Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, I was very immediately told, don't do this work. Don't do it. And we talked about Dr. Ramsey, you talked about faculty and stuff like that and non-tenured. I was a postdoc. You think you're at the top of the ladder when you get your PhD, and then suddenly you're back at the bottom when you're a postdoc. And I didn't want to ruffle any feathers. I had just moved. I was in a completely culture shock of moving from Toronto, Canada, one of the most diverse cities in the entire world, to Houston, Texas, also very diverse, but I had never even been to Texas before. And so I immediately kind of shut down and said, no, of course, no, I won't do that. And, as I spent 2 years there, I started to do some grand rounds on LGBTQ inclusivity. I started to talk a little bit more about it. I started to engage a little bit more in community work, but it was a very silencing conversation in terms of, no, I don't think that this is a good idea. And because it was one person's perspective and my supervisor at the time, I was immediately saying, okay, I won't do this. I won't talk about it. And so I think that we have to also, think about the ways in which not only junior faculty, and especially as a, non-tenure, assistant professor, doing that, but then also our postdocs, our grad students, our research assistants, not even just our students within the classroom, but also all other students, like Dr. Ramsey was saying, even, the research assistants who work with us, administrative staff, anybody on campus, anybody that you interact with, to recognize how even just one conversation can kind of shut down not only research, but an entire important conversation to have. And, even though in Canada it was inclusive and diverse, I want to also point out, and this is in a completely different direction, but a lot of people have this idea of Canada being, this ideal place. What happens in November, we're moving to Canada. I have my friends calling me saying, you'll let me in, right? And it's a joke, but Canada has a very racist history. And we also have to remember what Canada is about for our Indigenous peoples, to remember the residential school system, the 60s scoop, the foster care system. Racial profiling and racism is real in Canada. It is not that it doesn't exist. LGBTQ rights, yes, we got marriage equality and same-sex parenthood and all that, but there is still so many implicit biases around LGBTQ identities and microaggressions that happen on a daily basis. Not to bring up research, but in my research, a lot of gay fathers at the park get, oh, you're giving mom the day off. Oh, are you babysitting? It's your babysitting day. Those things hurt. Those things cause this idea of what we call a teachable moment, of saying, do I have to now teach my kid about the fact that stigma and discrimination against gay fathers exists? And I think we have to think about those teachable moments, just like George Floyd, just like Breonna Taylor. We have to use those teachable moments for our students, but also all those around us. Some incredibly powerful articles that I've read is that with COVID-19 and everything going on this past, summer and past few months, we're all in stages of grief. We're grieving right now. And so to think about the ways, not only that we are not grieving the same, as Dr. Lopez said, right? We don't have the same experiences, but we are all in some level of grief. And so I think that will allow us some flexibility, some mental health concerns, some care and compassion for our students, for our grad students, for our postdocs, for our fellow colleagues, for our staff, not just faculty, but let's bring up staff into this, of saying let's all be a little bit kinder and acknowledge what's going on within our society today.
And I love what you said. You said teachable moments, because in the classroom, and it doesn't matter if you're teaching math, psychology, healthcare, religion, teachable moments come unexpectedly. And I think oftentimes as an educator, we sit there and that teachable moment occurs, and then we just ignore it as if a unicorn just walked by and we just, well, I got to get back to this lecture. And oftentimes it's because we're not equipped. Like, we don't really feel like we can engage and further that conversation. But what I do is, if I don't have the personal tools, I know some people who do. And so we're going to come back to that conversation, even if it's just to acknowledge what students in the classroom are feeling. And I think that's the one thing that as an educator that we oftentimes can miss. And we most certainly can miss it now that we have this online platform, because I don't see you, touch you, feel you, taste you, none of the, well, maybe not taste, but none of those things that are occurring in an online platform. So how do we still connect and take advantage of those teachable moments? I really love that you said that. So let's move on, because we're gonna look. We started this thing at 1 o'clock, and I know some people jumped on at 1, and some people jumped on maybe an hour later. But look, we could go on all day. But we have a couple other things that we want to allow our panel to perhaps address, and then we'll wind this down. Okay, so I'm going to ask this question, and anyone can jump in on this. What social movement resonates most with you, and why?
I guess I'll go ahead. I'm so bad at answering questions directly, by the way. I saw this question ahead of time. I was like, oh my gosh, that's a hard question. That is such a hard question. And so because of that, I don't have one answer, but I think that what I'll say is, from the social movements that I've been taught about, for example, I learning in college and undergrad about the massacre that happened at Tlatelolco in Mexico City in 1968, a youth-led movement, and then seeing these more current movements, you see young people at the forefront. And so for me, it's been about the social movements that have, and the civil rights movement, right? It was these young folks out there, and the Chicano movement was high school and college students like asking for a better education. And so for me, it's in young people. That's what inspires me. And I think oftentimes as I've gotten older, gotten more cognizant of how deficit we are about youth. We as folks older than 30 are about youth, and oftentimes I'm sitting in meetings and there's just not enough hope and trust placed in young people. And I'm like, these young people have been leading these social movements, Black Lives Matter, for so long. And so I think that's what's given me hope is young people. I'm a mom of 2 kiddos, 4 and 6 and 4 and 8. So I'm bad at remembering how old they are now, COVID brain. And so, I just think about, I can't wait for them to be teenagers and just, I remember that age very fondly, being like a teenager and being active in the community. And so that's what motivates me is young people. And I want to put what I can, my support, my encouragement, and monetarily speaking too, back up youth in however I can. That's where my hope is.
Sure.
I want to go in and say, well, it's kind of 2 movements, but I'm thinking more of a time frame instead. I'm thinking about the civil rights movement and the early Black Panther movement. More so, I'm thinking about the civil rights movement because I'm thinking about strategies. When we think about social justice, I always think that there's more than one way to get to a particular goal. So when I think about strategizing, particularly with with King, like he didn't want to be this person, 26-year-old working on his dissertation at BU, and then he has to come down because SCLC is kind of about to split. And then how the civil rights movement, all those workers expand the news, social media from 10 minutes to 15 minutes to 30 minutes to an hour. Sometimes we forget the news expanded based on the coverage of the civil rights movement across the country. And another thing, the early Black Panther Party, 2 reasons in particular, because while we're talking about social justice, again, I'm talking about social injustice and free lunch in America, kids eating. Also, more than that, the free clinics, particularly tracking sickle cell. Professor Alondra Nelson did a real great book of this about Body and Soul to show how the Black Panthers were ahead on tracking sickle cell by placing free clinics in communities, with people who might not be into the Black Panther Party, but who are definitely into at least being, healthy. And I think about, again, these clinics as social media. Eventually 13 were opened across the country. And again, 100,000 kids were fed. 100,000 kids, we see free lunch came about. So I'm just still really thinking education. That's something I really like about that movement.
Good, thank you. So, and I'll just insert myself in this for a moment because I'm a child of the 60s. And so my parents were directly involved in the movement, specifically with SNCC. For those that know about SNCC, they were SNCC officials. And so oftentimes when you hear civil rights, you think of Martin Luther King. It's much bigger than Martin Luther King. There were so many organizers and so many young people. And I really appreciate that statement that the people that made the civil rights movement what it ultimately became was not the elders. The elders were sitting at home, let's be honest. The grandparents, they were supporting it, but they were sitting at home. These were oftentimes middle, high school students and college students. My mom dropped out of Spelman to get involved in SNCC and didn't return because she was so engaged with that. So that resonates, I guess, a lot with me, but I also see what's happening with the Black Lives Movement and some of the other movements that are taking place. And we all know that movements, if you just take the first part of that, move, that it is designed to be fluid. It is not designed to be stagnant. And I think sometimes people are just saying, oh, well, it's going to come and go and then we don't have to worry about it. But a true movement will move. That's why it's called a movement. It will go from one place to another, and if you're not ready, you're going to miss it. So my question is, how does, and this is really for anyone on the panel, so can the Black Lives Matter movement or similar organizations, can they coexist with the Blue Lives Matter movement? And if so, what does that look like? I know that's a loaded question.
And while our panelists are thinking, we also have a question from Sean Johnson.
And the question is?
At times, Sean Johnson says, at times social justice advocates express feelings of burnout. What advice would you give educators who are committed to social justice but experience such feelings?
Do you have a preference for which one of those we answer first?
No.
Go for the one that our audience member just asked.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a really important question, especially because of COVID-19 and the, this uncertain time that we're living in already, right? And then you add to it all the social issues that have already existed before that and that are exacerbated during this time. So it could bring on a lot of feelings of burnout. Also, like really unrealistic expectations from work because of the capitalist society we live in, where we don't have time for breaks. And so I think for me, it's been setting boundaries and knowing when to say no. And it sounds so cliche, but when we say no to something, we're saying yes to ourselves. There's probably a poster about that somewhere. And so for me, it's really putting that into practice. I'm one of those people that loves to be in the mix. I say I love to be in the mix of things, and people are always, telling me, how do you do all these things? But I love to be busy. And so for me, that's been hard to say no. But I have to be here for my children, for my partner, for myself. And so do as I say, not as I do, right? Because it has taken me, I'll admit, it has taken me like 4 months of this pandemic to finally say, oh yeah, I think I need to start working out again. Just kind of waiting and seeing what was going to happen. And another way is finding joy. Like because of this new situation, and I've been very fortunate that none of my family has been affected. So Dr. Ramsey, I'm really sorry to hear about your family. And, I have been able to be here at home and taking care of plants that I never used to take care of before. I never used to water them. And so it's become a way for me to interact with my mom. She loves talking about plants. And so we FaceTime, and she's in Dallas. And so talking to elders has been really important to me. Also self-care and family care through food. And then constant communication with my community through text. There's just so many group texts I'm on with other women of color and mamas of color. And we are just like processing this world together. And this, that's been really helpful. So I guess overall, it's like not trying to go through it yourself, like seek community. I have so many friends that have said, I'm sorry I'm taking up your time. And I'm like, no, I need your time. I need this conversation too. And so as much as we can, because right now it's really hard to have human connection, to be okay with that. For me, it's been okay with like not doing everything on my task list for the day, because at the end of the day, I'm like, it's a pandemic. And yes, I'm on the tenure track. That's hard to tell myself. But I need to self-preserve, because I have been moments in my time 10 years ago or more where I didn't self-preserve. And so I really felt the effects of that in my body. So I try to raise those alarms, because this feeling of burnout isn't just mental, it's like whole body experience. And so we really need to take care of ourselves and our bodies during these times.
Yes.
I would agree with everything you just said. I think boundaries is just so important. And as I talked about before about caring for our students and our faculty and staff, we have to care for ourselves. I mean, I know for me, I'm on a visa and my entire family's in Canada, and the border's closed and it keeps extending. I have no idea when I'm going to see my parents again, who are older. And so, there is this feeling of having to go through the day-to-day that's really hard for all of us, and to put all the social justice, and these issues are not new. George Floyd didn't spark like a whole new thing. These issues have been going on for, centuries. But it sparks something within us that adds to everything that's going on. And I think one thing that I really like to rely on, that I think Dr. Lopez touched upon as well, is to not take it all on yourself. It is not solely your responsibility to teach all your students about social justice. Whether that is leaning on podcasts and books and movies. I give one of their final assignments is a book or movie critique, and they have to watch a documentary or read a nonfiction book and write a critique about the isms in it and how they were portrayed and how they talked about and what they learned. And it takes a little bit of the onus off of me, just a little bit, to have a documentary teach them about one of the isms that we are discussing in the class, to give them just a little bit more information, a little bit more in-depth insight. I have guest lecturers come in to talk, to speak about their lived experiences, to take an hour and a half of my 3-hour lecture to just provide a little bit more information. That takes a little bit more of the burden off of me. So I would really rely on your colleagues, whether it's at the same institution, whether it's at different institutions, different countries, wherever you know people, to just ask. We're all in this together. We're all trying to figure this out. And if they're just as committed to social justice as you are, to say, hey, do you mind speaking to my class for like an hour this week to just provide a little bit of insight into X, Y, and Z, whatever it is that your specialty or your expertise is on? It would really help me, as it would give me one less week to prepare and one less thing to talk about, and the onus off of me. So really rely on other people. And if we could all help each other out with that, I think that could also really, really help as well.
Now, I do want to jump back to that heavy loaded question about Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter. Can they coexist? So,
That's
so,
a
so let me add to this. So Reverend C.T. Vivian, he said, people do not choose rebellion. It's forced upon them. Revolution is always an act of self-defense. So when we look at these movements that we see on the media, if revolution is an act of self-defense, then why is it that people are having to defend themselves? We only defend ourselves when we are what? Attacked. We only defend ourselves when someone else that is close to us or things that are dear to us are attacked, when our intellects are attacked. And so to coexist means that we have to acknowledge, or those groups or other similar groups have to acknowledge that one side has been attacked. And it's not until people understand the victimization that has gone on in this country and will continue, that we will probably continue to have the divide and the division that, and all the other isms will just continue to heighten, unfortunately. But I think as educators, we're in a position to at least affect change one student at a time. And the teachable moments are so critically important to take advantage of it. And sometimes just take a step back from your personal curriculum and say, but this semester I am going to add something a little different. This semester I'm going to add that podcast. I'm going to add that literary fiction. I'm going to include something a little bit different. Why? Because our students deserve it. So if no one else wants to address that.
You know what, I can add something to that.
Okay.
And think through this idea, you know, because I've been having this issue. I have like this existential crisis that I feel like particularly I've been going through for some time now, but it came to a heightened with this summer with George Floyd. Again, I'm from Jackson, Tennessee. And one of the things that is interesting to me is that growing up there, I want to point something out. When I was growing up, there was a black sheriff, smaller town, black sheriff, black police force. And a lot of times people policed on foot. A lot of the times my parents were educators. Many of the policemen were their former students. You know, I can remember one police officer would come over every day to get my grandmother's mail from her mailbox, come sit on her porch with her. At some point, though, my attitude towards police probably did change after a few personal experiences, you know, separating from my boyhood experiences. So by James Baldwin, do I believe that it can get along one day? I'm an optimist. I'm here, so I have to believe that. But the thing is, I think speaking to this point, when we're thinking about blue lives and black lives, maybe we're talking about a much more, you know, a larger idea or a larger project of thinking about what's going on with race, racism, privilege in America in general. So when we think about blue lives and black lives, I start to think that these are umbrella terms for much like larger issues going on. And if you're in a lot of different communities, or if you're a lot of different families, you've had police officers who were in your family. You know, so when you think about these different things, what actually goes on. So yeah, at one point, I do believe that there can be coexisting between different communities, but I do think we're going to have to be a lot more open about defining certain types of terms. What does Black Lives Matter mean? We do need to offer an explanation of that in much more detailed terms. Even what does the term defund the police mean? From my Vox podcast with the Ezra Klein show, I was really noticing how this defund the police term was something that started in the 90s about putting much more social, psychiatric care in police departments in addition to police officers, but we see how it's starting to change. So I really think going back to the root, and this was a professor who came up with this big study too, so that's why I'm really into it. So I think defining terms, looking at terms, and realizing Black Lives and Blue Lives Matter might be euphemisms for much bigger problems that we might not want to address or talk about or even name.
Yes, and it's interesting that you mentioned defunding, because that is a hot term that is used quite a bit, and I think a lot of people are a little confused about what that looks like. And so since we in the city of Fort Worth, if we were to take Fort Worth, voters just recently voted on, I believe, July 14th, they voted on a 50-cent sales tax. For those that voted and didn't know what you were voting on, that's what it is. And that 50-cent sales tax essentially allows the city to raise an additional $81 million. And that $81 million, now mind you, the city budget is about $1.8 billion, but $81 million comes from that 50-cent sales tax. And it is designed to address the positive activities and the events that the police department is currently doing, but there's also an extension or a partnership within the communities, all of the communities here. So you have the true community policing concept that is supposed to take place. And I feel pretty good that it is taking place in the city. But oftentimes when people hear defunding, what they're really thinking is disbanding. And I don't know in any civilized society that it is beneficial to disband a police department or a law enforcement agency. I think that is something that people probably misunderstand, but defunding just simply means just shifting your, as they say, shifting your shopping dollars. You're going to take those dollars that ordinarily may go to a law enforcement agency and you shift it somewhere, but there still has to be accountability. And I think that's the other part of the conversation. It doesn't matter where you shift it to, there still has to be accountability. You still have to measure and make sure that the people that really need to benefit from it, that they truly do benefit from that. Well, I know we're running out of time, and
we've got one question about what we've just been talking about from Tanya Rose.
Okay.
She says, why do we have to choose to support either Black Lives versus Blue Lives? Asking people to choose is also being tone deaf to the problem. And then she was curious if she could speak on this. Yeah. Sean Johnson said, in a capitalist society, quote, defund also grabs your attention.
And it's interesting too, because so often like education has been defunded, but I think it does strike a chord, right, when we're talking about the criminal system and police and why those, why is it a big deal to unfund, to lower the funding, right? Because it doesn't even mean like unfund completely, but lower the funding on it. I think of also. When I think about Blue Lives Matter, I think of a system rather than a people. And of course, people are complicit within that system, but it's a representative of that system that has not worked to protect particular groups of people, right? LGBT, Black and Brown folks who are targeted and criminalized and ultimately dehumanized by this system. And so yeah, I don't think it's necessarily neither or, right? But Blue Lives Matter exists because kind of connected to the quote that you opened us up with, right? Like that in response to Black Lives Matter, who was responding to all of this injustice. And so to me, I don't know, I think I was listening to a podcast at some point and the speaker made a point about how there are no blue lives, like blue human beings. And so I think it helps me to think of it as a system versus as like a group of people. And then it kind of nuances it a little bit more.
Sure.
And I think, Dr. Lopez, you bring up a really good point about safety. We talk about the police and we say, oh, they're here for our safety. Well, whose safety, right? Because it's not LGBTQ folks. It's not people of color. It's not a lot of different communities. They actually feel more unsafe if there are more police presence. There was a big, not to make it about Canada and Toronto again, but the police were actually banned from marching in Pride in uniform because a lot of LGBTQ folks and especially trans folks felt really, really unsafe with armed police officers so fully present there. If they wanted to march, they could march in their own gear and whatever and in their own street clothes, but not in uniform. And it was a very, very big debate and it was a hot topic. But there was this issue of safety and respecting that Pride is about LGBTQ folks and not about other people. It is about celebrating the protest and Stonewall and the years of activism that have happened. And especially within Toronto, it became a sore subject too, because there was a serial killer in Toronto for over 30 years that they just found guilty, Bruce McArthur, who murdered young gay men, primarily gay men of color, for years, and nobody did anything about it. People would go to the police, people would talk about it, people would say, you know, this man has been missing, and they didn't do anything. They didn't care. And so we always have to remember too, when we talk about, you know, Blue Lives Matter in the system, that this is a history of discrimination and stigma and abuse, especially with the bathhouse raids, where LGBTQ folks and primarily men were beaten and abused and killed because they were just having sex with other men. And so we always have to remember where the history comes from and where this sort of systemic racism and homophobia and transphobia and biphobia comes from. So I think that that's also a really important idea, and especially understanding what defund the police means. If you talk to most police officers, they say there's too much for us to do. We have to do mental health, we have to do health checks, we have to do wellness checks, we have to also protect our communities, we also have to serve and protect and law and order. And if you say, well, what about if social workers or psychologists or those who are trained in mental health do those wellness checks, do those other things that is not all on you? How can we collaborate to share in those resources and share in those responsibilities? And talking about that in terms of defunding the police, I think also helps.
I want to add one more comment about this idea about talking about police. Can Black lives and Blue Lives Matter get along? And I want to shift it from another perspective that I've been privy to get this summer. I would actually be more so interested in asking a Black police officer that question, simply because particularly after watching the limited HBO series Watchmen, and we got to kind of see what were Black officers actually experiencing on a force while still standing with that, because oftentimes I find that students will love to rage against the education, their university, and then, you know, I become complicit in that, even though I do not direct where lines of money go, this or that. So oftentimes when thinking about this, I've had the opportunity to dialogue with a lot of police officers who might seem to feel as if they're experiencing discrimination even within their own ranks of their own, or with their colleagues. But how, again, is this not, I guess I'm saying this is not maybe just a Black Lives and Blue Lives Matter thing, but maybe, again, is getting us something a little bit more internecine with this system of power, privilege, and racism. So I really do also, as we're college professors, and when colleges and universities make decisions and come on us, and this is kind of, so I wanted to also think about how are other people suffering within those things who are actually working for a system, and what is the recourse with this in terms of moving forward. So I really want to think about them as also doing a particular good, you know, but at the same time, the people who are also servicing these things. I know a lot of Black police officers in Dallas who have been open to speaking with a lot of community since George Floyd happened. And I kind of want to give them praise, because I don't necessarily know if their colleagues are as supportive of that. So that's why I just kind of do want to add that in as a caveat.
So Dr. Ramsey, somebody must have slid you a dollar bill to ask that question, because they know that I'm a retired police officer. And I would love to answer that question for you, but I know that we don't have the time to get deep into that. But you hit on some key things, and the word was suffering. Black officers, and I'm speaking in general terms, that are members of these organizations, that most of us, let me speak for myself now, but we walked into those organizations not thinking that we would all of a sudden become blue, because the minute that we walk out that door and get in our cars, we know that we're Black. As a matter of fact, I was pulled over more times as a police officer in regular clothes than before I became a police officer. And in every instance that I was pulled over in this city, I was pulled over by a white colleague. And when that white colleague approached the window, and I would kind of barely let the window down so he can see my face, I would ask, well, what did you pull me over for? And I think we've all seen the videos when people are curious. So I was curious. because I'm driving an unmarked city vehicle, which is supposed to be like my undercover car, but an unmarked city vehicle with all of the right registrations. And in every instance, I said, "What did you pull me over for?" And he had no response. None. So it's very real. I experienced it, but I would say that many Black officers in the different law enforcement, there's about 18,000 law enforcement agencies throughout the country, local, state, and federal, that they all experience their own form of discrimination among the ranks. And so it's hurtful to have to go through that. But most of the Black and brown officers that I work with, they came into these agencies wanting to change the community, wanting to give something that was beneficial to the community. And so it is that's what it is. But we could get into that. We're about to run out of time. I think that I saw Dr. Madison. I want to give a special shout out to Dr. Deshanta Holmes for putting this together, Dr. Laredo, our leadership at Trinity River, and all of the individuals, faculty, and staff that participated and had something to do with putting this together. So is Dr. Madison still on? I kind of want to close this and give him an opportunity if he had any thoughts, closing thoughts, anything that he wanted to share. Dr. Madison still out there? Maybe he's on, but okay. Professor Karina, do you still see him?
Let me look for you. I didn't see him log off.
Okay, that's okay. He might be engaged with something else right now. So
I am multitasking.
Multitasking. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you for putting me on the spot, Dr. Sabir, Professor White. Sounds to me as if there has been quite an engaging conversation, and I love it. You know, this is the arena of ideas, the university, the college setting, and to be able to engage in these type of conversations is critical to the profession and critical to the work that each and every one of us, do in the space in which we do it. So based on what I've heard, and I'm looking at some of the chat now, I don't mean to eavesdrop, but I certainly am delighted that the conversation, first of all, you all coordinated the conversation, and that the dialogue was so rich. And I'm certainly going to find a way to sit down and listen from beginning to end so that I can take a few notes, because I think I was learning quite a bit as well. So thank you to our guests. Hopefully our students will be your students at some point in time. We share a wonderful relationship with all of the universities that are represented here on the call. So we're certainly delighted. So on behalf of the leadership team at the Trinity River campus, thank you for helping us kick off our Connections Week. So thank you. And again, that's all I have to say. Thank you, Dr. Sabir.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So once again, on behalf of Tarrant County College, under the leadership of our Chancellor Giovannini and our campus president, Dr. Sean Madison, I want to thank everyone for tuning in, and I ask that you continue to be the ambassadors in higher education that you are. Thank you to our panel for sitting with us for 2 hours and engaging with us and giving us their candid thoughts and sharing their experiences. And I most certainly hope that we all receive something from this. Once again, this session was recorded. And so for those that may have come in late, you will have the opportunity to hear all of this as many times as you choose to. And before I forget, Professor, I needed to drop something in the chat that will allow our audience to provide feedback. So give me just a quick second here. And this will be a link Make sure I'm doing it right. Okay. You see it?
Not yet. There you go.
I think I have it highlighted in yellow. Okay.
Yes,
But
sir.
that is a response link, so it will allow you to give us some feedback on this session. So once again, thank you, panel, for spending your day with us. I'm sure that you could be doing other things, but you chose to be with us for these 2 hours. And thank you once again, TCC family, for joining in. And I wish everyone a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.